Hi, I'm Curtis Edlin, and I am a Senior Learning Advisor in the Self-Access Learning Center at Kanda University of International Studies in Japan. I also do work with the Research Institute for Learner Autonomy Education, or RELAY, and today it's my pleasure to talk a little bit about stress response in learning and performance and give my case for holism in the time that we have. As a brief overview, today I will be talking about why I'm looking at performance as well and why that's important in learning, about the building blocks of performance. We'll talk about stress response and some of the things we can do to blunt it, stressors that cause these responses, and then implications for learning and performance or things that we might be able to do at the institutional level or pedagogical implications in our classes. So the reason I like to look at performance is because learning itself is a sort of performance. The quality of our learning is mediated by some of the same things that mediate our performances in other areas. Furthermore, we're generally assessing students, whether we like to or not, because we're required to by our institutions or other powers that be, but those assessments are not really a complete overall understanding of the student's knowledge. Is basically a test of their performance on some sort of task or memory recall or something else. So if we're going to talk about performance, we can briefly look at what it is. So here are a couple of definitions on it, and the common connections between these definitions are that there is sort of a cognitive or mental element of it, but there's also more of a procedural element or the execution that happens. This is not just in sports and physical execution of motor skills, but other procedural skills. For example, I work with language students most commonly, and you can develop procedural skills in the same way to automatize them with things like grammar, which is going to be supremely important in using the language. Stephen Cotterill looks at some of the different determinants of performance, and it could be different personal characteristics, quality of preparation, environmental factors, state factors, personalized strategies, the cognition, confidence, coping strategies. The reason I bolded some of these is that those ones can be really affected by stress, which is what I wanted to talk about today. To an extent, some of the others can as well, like we'll see how it affects quality of preparation. It certainly affects and is affected by sleep and nutrition. Environmental factors can affect it as well, and we'll see how it plays on cognition as well. Another way to think about it is what Marcus Rabb calls the building blocks of performance, that all performances require this interplay of memory, of perception, emotion, and cognition. And so these are really dynamic in the interplay between them, but the important point to me for this presentation is that pretty much all of these can be influenced and affected by stress and stress responses as well. So what are some things that lead to high quality learning and performance? Obviously, this list is non-exhaustive, but it's good to think about these things as we move forward because it grounds it in something. So obviously, we need practice. That's non-negotiable. And there have been many champions of practice and deliberate practice, like Anders Ericsson, and it becoming popularized in Malcolm Gladwell's book that talked about the 10,000 hour rule, outliers. But also quality of practice is shown to be important as well. And part of that quality of practice is due to attention, working memory, strategy, and things like that. Working memory was shown to have a significant impact on development of skill over time on that quality of practice. So what's happening in a stress response? We all know what it feels like physiologically, but what leads to that physiological response? Well, as a reaction to stress, we have a few hormones that our body is producing or releasing and upregulating. We have adrenaline, also called epinephrine, just depending on where it's from, and noradrenaline or norepinephrine, and we have some cortisol, which has been talked about by many people. We're actually well adapted for stress in the short term. One of the other things, so when we release this adrenaline, our attention is actually better, our memory recall is better, our memory encoding is better. But we're not really well adapted for it in the long run because adrenaline is released quickly and it's kind of goes through our system quickly and then it's done. Cortisol builds up over time. And so in the short term, this is good because some cortisol can also help drive attention, but we're not really well adapted for chronic, prolonged stress. So levels can build up over time and it can last in our system much longer. And these effects from cortisol are things that we generally don't want to have, both cognitively and just in our body. Like if we're going to have different insulin response, and high cortisol levels can contribute to things like development of type 2 diabetes. So it really leads to burnout for a lot of people as well. And the thing about cortisol also helping with attention, because it does a lot of good things naturally, like wakes us up in the morning. We have this natural spike as our highest cortisol levels right as we're waking up. It agitates us, it moves us to action. But when we look at cortisol levels versus attention, which is important in things like learning and performance, it's an upside down U. So if we don't have much cortisol, it's hard to pay attention to something when there's kind of no stress interest there. But when we have too much, it becomes difficult to manage as well, and equally difficult to attend to what we need to. So Stanford's Robert Sapolsky talks about it, saying that neurons in parts of the brain related to learning, memory, and judgment don't function as well under stress. So one of the things that appears to happen is cortisol appears to divert attention towards emotional and threat responses. And a little bit of this attention diversion can be good, and the kind of synergy between like the cognitive logical side of things and the emotional side of things. But if it's too strong and has too much of a pull, it can make engaging in those sort of strategic logical decisions more difficult and more effortful. And one of the things that happens there is what we call ego depletion, or exhaustion of willpower, essentially. For example, in the old study where, psychology units driving everyone crazy, they brought in two groups of people and they were going to try a task which was actually impossible. It was a pure white puzzle that was unsolvable. And they wanted to see how long people would persist on it and use their willpower and moving forward. And before they went into the experiment, they were told, sorry, we need to get something ready. We'll be right back. And the first group was allowed to eat chocolate chip cookies. And the second group saw the cookies but wasn't allowed to eat them. Sorry, that's for someone else, but you can have these radishes here. The findings were that the group that was able to eat the cookies beforehand and didn't have to exert that willpower, it wasn't as effortful, were able to reserve a lot more of that for trying on this impossible pure white puzzle. I think the result was they lasted over twice as long before giving up on it. So when we're in stressful situations, or we have to exert more willpower as a result of maybe these high stress times and things like that, it can make learning and performance less sustainable over time too. It makes us burn out more easily. So one thing that can be beneficial for learning and performance both, and I'm sure everybody's heard of this by now, but it's flow state. So this was originally coined and researched by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and there's another author who's done a lot of writing on it in popular science. He got interested in it because of following extreme sports athletes in the 90s, Stephen Kotler. So some of the things that can lead to increased performance and learning from flow states are more information intake, we have more attention, so increased salience of the things we're learning and the memories we're committing. Faster connections is basically increased pattern recognition, and we have more lateral thinking, so it can also be used for outside of the box, far-flung connections, creativity, essentially. And one of the key tenets with flow is that we need an optimal challenge. It can't be too easy, because then it doesn't demand our cognitive resources and we can't fully focus everything on it, but it also can't be too difficult outside of what we're able to do, or it's past what we're able to apply as far as our focus and resources and attention there. So you might identify that that matches up with that inverse U that we were talking about before, where if there's no stress, there's not really much attention, but if there's too much stress, there's also not attention. We're not able to handle it and keep up with it. One important bit that I'd like to add here, because it's connected to sort of my work and what I'm really interested in, is about autonomy. And this is from self-determination theory from Ryan and DC, or DC and Ryan. They've co-authored a lot together. But they found that if someone had an optimal challenge, but they felt coerced into the activity, meaning essentially they didn't have autonomy, they were unlikely to find interest, involvement, or flow. And so in this case, by self-determination theory, when we talk about autonomy, it's not just the ability to make decisions for oneself, but it's more about acting in a way that's congruent with one's beliefs or values and things like that. The nice thing about this, because it's essentially a theory of human motivation, and they also look at well-being and things. But if you look at autonomy and the most autonomous forms of motivation, one of the things that happens is it requires less energy, less willpower, it's less effortful, and some people actually feel energized by it. And this is what happens a lot of times in flow. People feel good from it, they feel energized. If we can get this with our students, that's absolutely where we want to get. Now, there's some other ways to think about it and think about how we might cope with it. So Sapolsky again says, we basically evolved to be smart enough to make ourselves sick. Because it's not just psychological, but it's also not just our hormones and neurotransmitters and things like that affecting us, because our thoughts can actually affect those. We can think about something unpleasant and trigger the same stress response with nothing physical having ever happened to us. So that's going to point to mindset being very important. And we've seen this in a few different things as well. So there was this study by Scholler and Higgins looking at when people didn't reach their goals of different orientations towards prevention or promotional focuses. Generally, people that were highly motivated in this and not meeting those would have actually higher rates of clinical depression or higher rates of clinical anxiety. But to the extent that people had a belief in transitory failure, essentially a growth mindset, and the degree to which they were able to engage in reflection and understand what went wrong instead of it being just a judgment of themselves, they were able to buffer against these effects of their failure in a particular task. So that really points to some of the benefits of reflection in a growth mindset. And one of the other things we can see is the difference between assessing something as a threat versus a challenge. And so the same task, when assessed as a challenge, had a lower cortisol response relative to assessing it as a threat. And that threat usually was due to an idea of lack of control and a high ego involvement, right? This is a judgment on me. So of course we can think of how this might influence how we set up our classes or assessment or things like that. So I think one thing that's important to understand is that these stressors and stress responses that affect our cognition, memory, recall, etc., they can be life-wide. Our body's not smart enough to really differentiate between those different things. So they'll all affect our learning and performance no matter where they come from. This could be interpersonal and social stressors, dietary issues, could be from poor sleep and rest, or burnout, or poor physical health. And so this is part of the call to looking at education in a more holistic way. So while it's been brief, here are some of the takeaways. Prioritizing learner well-being is going to be necessary for more sustainable learning. Focusing on growth and development is going to allow learners to approach challenge instead of threat. Awareness raising can help them to understand and take control of the stress in their lives and maybe to prioritize some of these areas. Rest is also essential, not instead of good learning or performance, but for it. Being supportive and kind with our students is going to be helpful for them reaching their best learning and performance as well. And because learning and performance is everywhere, it's in our work and personal lives and hobbies, we can apply it elsewhere. And finally, promoting autonomy can also lead to more sustainable learning and help mitigate some of the effects of stress. Here are the references and some further reading if you're interested. And the second page. Thank you all for your time.